Hey everybody, sorry I couldn't make it today, but we're going to talk about my program evaluation, which was implementing an effective advisory program after a school merger. We're going to try and get this one down to like 10-15 minutes. The first recording was 20, so here we go. So, quick roadmap before we start. The Academy of Science and Innovation, the school that I work at, was created after a merger of two smaller schools during the summer of 2016. During that transition, the new administrative team instituted two programs to try and bolster school culture. These programs were called Innovation and Advisory, and both took place within the regular school hours. Innovation and Advisory had been operating for 7 months when I started this evaluation, but we hadn't really collected much data on them. Now we know school culture and climate are especially important all the time, but especially after two schools merge. So to help us look at the culture and climate of these schools, we're going to implement a framework, and we'll talk about it more later, by Glassy, Gullidge, and Cox from 1997. Now, spoiler alert, turns out that the innovation program that we had was not at all appropriate for the needs of our school, but the advisory program was appropriate, but not quite effective. So some changes all around, but we're going to end up cutting the advisory program in my recommendations in the end and tweaking the advisory program. So first, let's go back to the school merger. We had medical professions and Two Rivers. Medical professions had 450 students in grades 6 through 12, so it was a middle and high school, and it had a lot of transition in its administration. There were 4 different principals in 4 years, but they were housed in a nice new building, brand new facilities. On the other hand, Two Rivers, where I was from, had 300 students in grades 9 through 12, so just a high school. We had steady leadership, same principal for the past 5 years, but our facilities weren't that good. We were actually broken into 2 incubator campuses, one in the Colt building by Route 9 or by 91, and one in the Learning Corridor, closer to Trinity. So together, let me back up for a second. So medical professions had a very inconsistent advisory program. Basically, every time a new administration came in, they switched things up. But Two Rivers had a more consistent advisory program, consistent with the administration. When they merged last year, they became the Academy of Science and Innovation, which housed 770 students in grades 6 through 12 in that new building that medical professions was in. Our students are about half Latino, 28% Black, 19% white, a little more than half from Hartford, and about half free and reduced lunch. Half teachers from medical professions and Two Rivers each became the Academy of Science and Innovation with some layoffs, unfortunately. And the administration decided we needed a new innovation and advisory program to help and bolster school culture. Now, the theory of action behind that innovation and advisory program was this. If students feel a sense of belonging in their school and can become involved in the school culture, for example, sports or clubs, then the students will feel comfortable in the school and have more positive social interactions at high levels of achievement. The thought being that we have kids from these two schools that are very fragmented, and we need to bring them back together through some sort of method, and they thought that anchoring kids in sports and clubs and activities and giving them a sense of belonging would really help. So they started these two things, innovation and advisory. Innovation was 30 minutes daily, Monday through Thursday, so 4 days a week. Now, teachers chose to run an extracurricular activity, such as sport, a club. One group did like a zombie apocalypse scenario club. Anyway, then students signed up for these with a Google form. They had the first, second, and third choice, and then they got placed in them within the first week of the school year. Now, the purpose of this was enrichment, to give students the ability to have an anchoring point, a club or a sport or something like that within the school day. Because in addition to having the issue of the two schools merging, remember, we're both magnet schools. So kids can live up to 45 minutes away and get bussed into us. So there was issues with transportation and kids being able to be part of clubs. So they tried to institute those during the school day. The other program was a more traditional advisory program. It was 30 minutes, but only once a week on Friday. It consisted of pre-prepared lessons created by counselors, psychologists, our school psychologists, and our PBIS coordinators. And those had more of a focus on respect, kindness, and social emotional skill building. Unfortunately, they were only distributed via email with no training for teachers on them. And in fact, the school counselors and psychologists and PBIS coaches didn't talk to each other while they were creating these. They basically just parsed them out, split them up, said, counselors are going to take the first one of every month, psychologists are going to take the second advisory of every month, and so on. And they didn't really interact or talk much about them. So they were very disjointed. and like I said, with no training. So in this system, we have a few stakeholders. We have the teachers. The teachers are the ones that designed and implement innovation. Remember, it's that enrichment kind of time. And the teachers implemented advisory, but they didn't plan it. It was designed, again, by the school support staff and administration. They created the advisory program. The students, the most important stakeholders, were able to choose what innovation they wanted to go to, but were randomly placed into advisory classes. And the parents, who should be a great asset, really were untapped assets. They want their students to succeed, in school and socially and emotionally, but they weren't really involved in this program in any way, at least up until this point. Now we're going to talk a little bit more about the stakeholders and their dispositions and their feeling towards advisory and things like that in a second. But before we go any farther, I want to introduce this framework that I mentioned before. Now these three people, Glassy, Gullidge, and Cox from 1997, said there were a certain number of different types of advisory that you could have. You could have an advocacy advisory, which was focused on student to teacher relationships, a community advisory, which is peer-to-peer or student-to-student relationships, a skill advisory, which focuses more on social emotional learning skills, executive functioning skills, things like that. And the skills purpose was really what our advisor was for. And an enrichment advisory, which is for adding extracurriculars, something in addition to the regular academics, sports, whatnot. This is what our innovation was. An academic advisory, where people are getting interventions, support for schoolwork. An administrative advisory, where you're essentially just passing out papers, giving information and announcements. And a break advisory, which was not originally part of the framework, but I've added it here. And the break advisory is essentially a break from the stress of school, where students listen to music, walk around the room, or sleep. And we'll see why in a second I had to add that. Let's go back to those stakeholders, specifically the students and the teachers. In front of you, you have the results of a culture and climate survey, where students and staff were asked to agree or disagree with different statements. Anything from I feel welcome in the school to I feel supported academically, things like that. And all of those questions were grouped into constructs. And I've coded these constructs along the framework I just talked about. We've got advocacy, community, skills, enrichment, things like that. So if you look at these, two things struck me. First off, all of the staff responses are more favorable than the student responses. Remember, this bar graph is the percent of students and staff that agreed or had a positive response to those statements. So in general, staff seem to have a more positive or agreeable response across the board to all aspects of school culture, which indicates there might be some sort of disconnect between what students are seeing and what teachers are perceiving. Some sort of disconnect. The second thing that really struck me about this is how low social emotional security is. Look at this. Less than 20% of students agreed with statements like, I feel social emotional safety in my school. I don't feel bullying. I feel like I can talk to people. I feel like I can take social risks and maybe sit down with a new group at lunch. That's incredibly low, not just for a school, but compared to the other constructs as well. Social learning is also low. Social learning is things like my teachers help me learn how to have positive interactions with my peers. My teachers help me organize my time. My teachers help me make good choices, things like that. Both of those are super low, which makes you wonder why we only spent 1 day on advisory, on skill building, but 4 days a week on innovation. You start to think even more about that with this graph. Here we've got two pie charts of the involvement of MPTPA or MedPrep and TRMHS, Two Rivers, before the merger. If you look at this, there are no students at MedPrep that were not involved, right? We've got about a third in sports, a third in clubs, and a third in other things. And at Two Rivers, only about 28%, a little more than a quarter, are uninvolved. Most people are in some sort of club, be it a sport, maybe singing, something with music, but it doesn't seem like involvement is that big of an issue. So we can say at this point that perhaps innovation wasn't really necessary for our school, seeing as most students weren't already involved beforehand, and it wasn't that big of an issue. If we go back to this graph, where is it? School connectedness is actually one of the higher ones that most people agreed with. Now, unfortunately, having a innovation period that wasn't very necessary had some unintended consequences. The biggest two are lack of fidelity and discipline incidents. With lack of fidelity, I gave the staff a survey asking them whether they were implementing innovation or not, and about half said they were, but I felt it was lower than that. So I actually ran around the school and got to all 58 innovation classes we have in the school and coded them. Either they were fully participating in innovation, they were doing some sort of enrichment, where at least half the class was involved in something and the teacher was too. Partial participation, where less than half the class was doing some sort of enrichment activity, extracurricular, but some students were, or no one in the room was. 37 of 58 innovations, as I walked around, had no one, not even the teacher, participating. And only 10 had at least half the class participating. And those tended to be things like playing basketball in the gym or watching a movie, things that didn't need a lot of overhead. So really, innovation didn't happen the way it was intended. In addition, there were discipline issues. So this is a graph of skipping referrals to the office per hour for the different blocks we have during the school day. We've got block 1, block 2, innovation advisory, lunch, block 3, and block 4. It turns out that the rate of students skipping or being written up for skipping was 5.5 times greater during innovation advisory than it was during block 4, which is the next most skippingest block, I guess you could say. So students are not in classes, lack of fidelity, all sorts of unintended consequences. But there are deeper issues too here. If we go back to that culture and climate survey and dig a little deeper into the actual statements that students and teachers were asked to agree and disagree with, we see some more things. These three are the lowest agreed with statements, or the most negative statements out of the entire thing. There are groups of students in my school who exclude others and make them feel bad for not being part of the group. A decent number of people agreed with those things, or even strongly agreed, which is not good. I have seen other students insulted, teased, or otherwise verbally abused more than once by other students in my school. Look at this, 31% from MPTPA and 15% strongly agreeing. That's pretty bad. And in my school, adults teach me how to express emotions in proper ways. Remember, the first two we're looking for. Agreeing is not a good thing, and this last one, disagreeing, would not be a good thing. And there's actually quite a few people that disagreed or neutral on this one. So it doesn't seem like students are getting that social emotional learning either. So to sum up, we have some surface issues, high levels of skipping and other discipline issues, and low levels of fidelity in both innovation and the advisory programs. The root causes we talked about was a disconnect between the student and teacher perception, a low level of social emotional safety, and low level of social learning in the school. So what can we do? Well, there's some immediate actions we have to take right away. First off, we need to stop innovation. We're going to remove it and implement the old Two Rivers Advisor Program. Since it was already implemented last year, the materials are all created, and essentially it takes each day of the week and provides some sort of structure to it. Monday being kind of executive functioning skill day, Wednesday being a social emotional skill building day, Friday being competition, Tuesday and Thursday being focused more on academics. And I'd also like to begin hallway sweeps during advisory periods to ensure students are actually in their classrooms receiving this instruction. Down the road, though, we need to, like I said, remove innovation and replace it with two things. Implement a daily and structured social emotional learning program during advisory and allocate time for teachers to be trained monthly with it. So have the advisor program every day, right, instead of innovation, but make sure there's training involved, right? Or we can implement a seminar-style social emotional learning class for 6th grade, 9th grade, and other selected groups of students to be taught by one teacher. And this is actually something we're seriously looking at for next year because students in 6th grade and 9th grade are really in those transition years. And there's also data to suggest that implementation by one teacher, one highly trained teacher, can often be more effective than spreading out the responsibility amongst a bunch of teachers. In addition, we need to get a little more feedback from the students and get rid of that disconnect. We need to develop a culture and climate survey that can be given more often, has shorter turnaround time, and can reveal specific groups of students with low levels of social emotional safety. One thing that I realized I forgot to mention is that the data that we were looking at earlier is actually not from ASI, it's from the previous schools. We give a culture and climate survey in November, December, and we don't get the data back until like May, right? It's quite some time, which is why there might be a disconnect between students and teachers. Next, we need to allow the student support team to meet monthly to use the survey data to drive advisory lessons and target specific students for interventions. So if we got that data back sooner, we wouldn't have as big of a disconnect between students and teacher perceptions, because we would know how students are feeling, and we could target those students that reported higher levels of bullying or being uncomfortable. We should include parents and other stakeholders in programs and events to boost social emotional safety and learning outside the school, such as perhaps a walk to eliminate the hate sponsored by by parents, and a Big Brothers Big Sisters program. We're actually looking at implementing a virtual or a distance mentoring program with Big Brothers Big Sisters next year, which I'm very excited about. And lastly, we need to allow the school leadership team to review the culture and climate survey data along with all other available data to monitor and modify all school climate structures on a monthly basis. We can't wait till the end of the year to get the data back and try and fix things then. If you have any questions or comments, concerns, or frustration over the background puns, there's a stakeholder picture during the stakeholder section. Anyway, you can email me at mr.janes.math@gmail.com or just put it in the group chat. Thanks for watching, and I did less than 20 minutes, so there you go.